The auditorium was buzzing with excitement, filled with the proud chatter of families and the flutter of graduation programs being fanned through the air. The day was warm, and sunlight spilled through the tall windows, casting long beams of light across the polished floor. Rows of folding chairs stretched in every direction, each one occupied by someone who had waited months, maybe years, for this moment. Among them sat a man in crisp military dress, blues ribbons and medals glinting subtly under the lights, posture straight, expression composed. He was a U.S. Marine, a father, and today, more than anything else, he was simply a proud parent waiting to see his son walk across the stage. It was just before the ceremony was to begin that the two guards approached. One of them, tall and young, with an earpiece tucked under a short crop of hair, leaned in and said something quietly. The Marine turned his head, listened, then responded just as quietly, but there was tension immediately. The second guard, older and more impatient, gestured toward the exit with a rigid arm, as if directing someone off a restricted airstrip. A few people nearby turned to look. The Marine's brow furrowed, confusion crossing his face. He reached slowly into his breast pocket, producing a ticket and an ID, pointing gently toward the section listed on the slip. Still, the guards remained firm. Whispers began spreading in the rows behind him. Someone murmured something about an unauthorized guest, another speculated it was a security issue. To those who didn't know him, he was just a man in a military uniform, maybe showing up in the wrong section, maybe even impersonating someone. The context was missing, but the optics were clear. A black man being confronted by security in a room where most didn't look like him, in a moment that should have been his to enjoy. He stayed calm, his voice measured, his gestures deliberate. He didn't want to cause a scene, but the guards seemed determined to remove him, ignoring the documents he was trying to show them. It was at that moment a quiet shift rippled through the space, not from the stage or the microphone, but from somewhere deep within the audience. 6 men, seated at different points in the auditorium, began to rise. They moved in unison, though no words had been spoken. Each one wore civilian clothes, but there was no mistaking the way they carried themselves, back straight, movements economical, eyes steady. They approached not with aggression, but with purpose, threading silently through the aisles until they stood between the Marine and the 2 guards. The guards paused, thrown by the sudden presence of these men, who said nothing but radiated an unmistakable authority. One of the SEALs produced something from his jacket, perhaps a badge, perhaps an ID, and passed it to the lead guard. The room, once filled with idle conversation and rustling paper, quieted. Even those who had been unaware now turned, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. No voices were raised, no threats exchanged, just a silent, powerful moment of recognition and quiet confrontation. The guard's demeanor shifted subtly. There was hesitation now, a visible recalculation. The older one lowered his arm, the younger one looked away. No apology was offered, but the message was clear. The Marine remained standing, flanked now by the 6 men who had wordlessly affirmed his right to be there. His shoulders didn't sag, but there was a momentary easing in the tension that had been there before. He nodded to them, acknowledging their gesture without needing to say anything. The Marine stood tall, his uniform immaculate dark blue coat pressed to perfection, white cap gleaming under the soft indoor lighting. The rows of medals on his chest weren't just decorations, they were a silent chronicle of decades of sacrifice, service, and unyielding discipline. He had served his country with honor, through tours and trials most in the auditorium couldn't imagine. But in this moment, in the place where he had come simply to celebrate his son's achievement, none of that seemed to matter. When the guards confronted him, he didn't react with anger. There was no outburst, no flare of indignation. Instead, there was a brief flicker of disbelief in his eyes, quickly buried beneath a layer of practiced composure. He turned slowly, facing them with calm, meeting their eyes directly. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in his tone was unmistakable, not the bark of a drill instructor, but the quiet command of someone used to being respected without ever needing to demand it. "I'm here for my son," he said, the words clear and even. "He's graduating today. That's my seat." The younger of the two guards fidgeted, glancing toward a supervisor who lingered in the background. The older one, less interested in nuance, gestured again toward the door. "This section is for families. You're going to need to leave." The Marine kept his stance. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his inner pocket and produced a neatly folded sheet of paper, his invitation, complete with his son's name and seat number. He extended it toward the guards, along with his military ID. "I'm in the right place." There was a beat of silence. The guard looked at the papers, but his eyes never truly focused on them. It wasn't about a ticket. It was about something else. Whether it was unconscious bias or a misguided assumption, the message had already been sent. He didn't belong, not in their eyes. Even in full uniform, even with documentation, he wasn't afforded the benefit of the doubt. The Marine stood there, momentarily suspended in a sort of public isolation. Around him, people watched but didn't speak. They shifted in their chairs, uncertain whether to intervene or remain bystanders. The silence was deafening. He could feel the eyes, some sympathetic, others simply curious, and still he didn't break. This wasn't the battlefield, it wasn't combat, but in a different way it felt just as violating. He had faced enemies with weapons and explosives, survived deployments that pushed every human limit, yet here he was, in a gymnasium lined with folding chairs and balloons, being treated like a trespasser. His composure didn't come from a place of pride, but from experience. He had learned long ago that dignity was something you carried with you, especially in spaces where it was denied. So he stood, holding his papers, waiting for reason to prevail or for the guards to escalate. He didn't speak again, didn't plead or argue. He didn't need to. The moment stretched longer than it should have, and while the confrontation had been quiet, it was deeply public. Everyone around them could see the absurdity of it, the insult embedded in every second that ticked by. A few people murmured. A mother in the row behind him frowned, her lips tightening, but no one said a word loud enough to matter. Still, the Marine remained still, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. His hands didn't tremble, his eyes didn't lower. He had stood at funerals with less emotion than he felt now, but none of it showed, because showing it would have been a loss. Showing it would have given them permission to twist the narrative. So he simply waited, not because he needed validation from the guards, but because he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of removing him from a place where he had every right to be. He had shown up for his son, and nothing, not confusion, not ignorance, not prejudice, was going to move him. Across the auditorium, the quiet tension had begun to ripple outward like waves across still water. The Marine, still standing firm beside his seat, had drawn the silent attention of more than just curious parents and restless students. Among the scattered rows, there were 6 men who noticed not just the confrontation, but the way it was unfolding. These men, dressed in plain civilian clothing, did not sit together, nor did they make their presence known when they first arrived. They hadn't come as a group. In fact, some had barely known each other before today. But all of them shared one thing in common. They were Navy SEALs, former brothers, in arms who had come to watch a fellow service member's child graduate. Each had their own reason for attending a nephew, a cousin, a godson, or a friend's kid. But as trained operators, the situation developing across the room caught their attention with clarity. They saw the stiff posture of the Marine, the way he held out his ID and invitation without anger, only resolve. They saw the dismissive body language of the guards, the subtle way the older one leaned in, close enough to threaten, far enough to avoid outright confrontation. And they saw the audience doing what civilians often do in moments like these, watching, but not acting. They didn't look at each other or give any verbal cue. There was no signal, no whispered plan. Their reactions came from muscle memory, from years of living in high-stakes environments where reading a room could mean the difference between life and death. These men were trained to observe patterns, sense threats, and respond with calm precision. And what they saw wasn't just disrespect. It was a moment where integrity was being tested, not by violence, but by apathy. The first SEAL to move was a tall man with broad shoulders and a trimmed beard, seated near the aisle. He stood slowly, without drawing attention to himself, as if stretching his legs, but he didn't sit back down. A moment later, another followed, a Latino man with a worn Navy baseball cap pulled low, who casually made his way to the edge of the row. One by one, the others rose from their seats, subtly but unmistakably repositioning themselves toward the heart of the incident. To the untrained eye, it may have looked like a group of restless attendees shifting for a better view. But to anyone watching closely, it was something else entirely. The spacing, the way they moved to triangulate the area, the way they said nothing at all bore the quiet, disciplined choreography of a team used to moving under pressure without alerting anyone who didn't need to know. Their body language spoke volumes. They didn't confront the guards outright, not yet. Instead, they formed a quiet perimeter, not blocking, but standing close enough to shift the dynamic. Their expressions were neutral, but their eyes were sharp, tracking every movement and word. To the guards, it may have seemed like a coincidence at first. But then one of the SEALs stepped slightly forward and folded his arms, not a challenge, but a statement. It was a subtle act of solidarity, yet deeply profound. The Marine looked toward them briefly, his face still unreadable. He didn't know most of them personally, but he understood instantly who they were and why they were there. In their posture, he saw something that transcended uniform, rank, or branch. It was respect, not just for his service, but for his right to be present in that room, for his dignity as a father and as a man. There was no need for orders, no rank to call upon. In that moment, they weren't acting under military command, they were acting under something older, something more binding, brotherhood, a commitment to watch each other's backs even when the battlefield was a high school gym and the enemy wasn't armed with guns but with assumptions. They weren't there to intimidate or escalate, they were there to make sure he wasn't alone. What happened next didn't erupt, it settled. The shift was almost imperceptible to those who weren't paying close attention, but to anyone who understood power, discipline, and presence, the change in atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. The 6 Navy SEALs, now standing in subtle formation around the Marine, weren't speaking, weren't gesturing, and weren't touching anyone, but their silence was louder than anything else in the room. The 2 security guards, who had moments earlier been firm and dismissive, found themselves staring into 6 faces that offered no threat, only unwavering resolve. There was no raised voice, no need for escalation. The SEALs didn't crowd or corner the guards, they didn't even move aggressively. They simply occupied space intentionally, confidently, and with a quiet force that made it clear that the moment was no longer under the guards' control. One of the SEALs, an older man with streaks of gray at his temples and an unmistakable stillness in his eyes, took a half step forward. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at the guards, his gaze level and unflinching, then at the Marine, and then back again. His posture was relaxed, but there was something in the way he stood, as if he had stood in the exact same way in dozens of countries and 100 more tense situations. Without introducing himself, without explanation, he let the moment linger. And that was the power of it. No one said what this was, no one had to. The guards began to understand it, not in their heads at first, but in their instincts. They were being looked at in a way most people never are, by men who had seen combat, who had executed missions few civilians could imagine, who had learned to assess threats not by volume or posture, but by intent. And these men had clearly made a decision. They weren't going to let this continue. The younger guard's eyes darted from one face to the next. He adjusted the radio clipped to his belt, suddenly very aware of how exposed he felt. The older guard crossed his arms, but there was a hesitation in the gesture. He had authority, yes, but he didn't have ground to stand on anymore, not morally, and increasingly not socially. The presence of the SEALs had recalibrated the scene. They had turned the Marine from an isolated figure into a man whose value and position were being reaffirmed by a silent wall of credibility, and that credibility was ironclad, because it didn't come from grandstanding or confrontation, it came from the absence of both. These men hadn't needed to shout. They hadn't needed to demand anything. They had just shown up, physically and morally, as if to say, "He's not alone, and neither are we." The audience, by now, had gone mostly silent. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence. A few students on stage had turned to look, shifting awkwardly in their gowns. Teachers and administrators stood uncertainly at the edge of the platform, unsure whether to intervene or let whatever was happening unfold. The air felt tight, not with fear, but with a kind of charged awareness. Everyone was waiting for what, no one was exactly sure, but they knew they were witnessing something. The Marine, for his part, hadn't moved. His papers still in his hand, his posture unchanged, but there was something subtly different now. The weight that had settled on his shoulders minutes earlier had been redistributed, not removed, but shared. And in the quiet standoff between prejudice and principle, it was now clear which side was gaining ground. It was in that stillness that the final blow was delivered, not by words, not by action, but by presence. 6 SEALs who could have used force, or rank, or aggression, instead stood like statues with purpose, erasing any illusion that the Marine's treatment was acceptable, not just because of who he was, but because of what this ceremony was supposed to mean. A moment of recognition, a moment of honor, a moment that had almost been taken from a father who had earned far more than just a seat in the audience. The silence that settled over the room wasn't awkward or confused, it was reverent. Whatever idle murmurs and scattered whispers had floated through the auditorium before were now gone, replaced by a heavy stillness, like the kind that follows a national anthem or a flag being lowered at sunset. Eyes that had previously wandered or glanced curiously toward the disturbance now remained fixed, attentive, and subdued. The scene had drawn every ounce of attention, and not because of spectacle, but because of the unmistakable clarity of what had just taken place. The Marine stood, still as ever, his papers now held loosely in one hand at his side. The 2 guards no longer said a word. They had stepped back, not by command, but by quiet necessity. The SEALs hadn't touched them, hadn't issued any threat or even spoken aloud, but in their silence and unspoken solidarity, they had spoken volumes. Whatever doubt had existed about the Marine's right to be there had been shattered. And in its place was something far more powerful than a mere correction. There was acknowledgement. All around the auditorium, people who hadn't known what to think now knew exactly where they stood. The tension had exposed something uncomfortable, something most would have preferred to avoid, but now that it had surfaced, no one could pretend it hadn't happened. And in the way the room fell quiet, there was a collective recognition that something wrong had nearly been allowed to stand unchallenged. The principal, having just approached the podium to begin the ceremony, paused as he took in the sight before him. He didn't speak for several seconds, scanning the rows of students and families before his gaze landed on the Marine. Their eyes met briefly. The principal gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, then adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. That gesture, though small, felt monumental. It carried no words, but it did carry meaning. It acknowledged that the ceremony could now continue, but not until the space had been reclaimed and restored to what it was supposed to be, a celebration, not a confrontation. Slowly, the SEALs returned to their seats, not all at once, not like a coordinated withdrawal, but in the same calm, intentional way they had risen. Their message had been delivered. their presence no longer necessary in that formation, quietly receded back into the fabric of the audience. They didn't need applause or recognition. They didn't need thanks. What they had done wasn't about performance. It was about principle. As they sat down, something happened that no one had planned and that no one would forget. People began to clap, not in a burst, not as a standing ovation. It started as a single pair of hands near the back, then another, then a few more. The applause wasn't loud, it wasn't celebratory. It was slow, deliberate, and filled with the weight of understanding. It spread through the audience like a wave not of excitement, but of respect. The Marine remained standing, stunned for a brief moment, not because he needed validation, but because he hadn't asked for any of this. He had only come to watch his son graduate, to see the boy he had raised walk across a stage and step into adulthood. He hadn't wanted attention, and yet here he was, at the center of it, not for what he had done, but for what he had endured and how he had endured it. His son, seated among the graduates in the front rows, had seen the entire thing. Their eyes met for the first time since the incident began. The son didn't smile, he didn't cheer, but in his gaze was something deeper than pride. It was understanding, the kind that reaches beyond words, beyond ceremony, a bond forged not just in blood, but in example. The applause slowly faded, replaced again by silence, but this time it wasn't heavy. It wasn't uncertain, it was filled with recognition, filled with respect, the kind of silence that didn't need anything else to be said. The Marine finally took his seat. No one looked away. No one forgot.